Wrath of the Lich King has two major changes to the PvE scene that's going to have your raiding team thinking about how best to build your roster to enable your success in the raids to come. Those are the buffs given by certain classes or specs are now raid-wide instead of being just party-wide, such as Unleash Rage or Moonkin Aura, and now there are two difficulties for raids between 25 and 10 man. Whilst 10 man was specifically designed by Blizzard to be more accessible and frankly just easier than 25, eventually there will start to be certain encounters that are challenging, and after all you've got 25 players to fit into two 10-man rosters, it makes sense to try and build them out in a way which is as good as it can be. Also, small side note, for gearing, many tier set bonuses and just tier gear in general in Wrath are either good or very good. For example, Next 10 drops 200 item level gear and 25 drops 213, but both will still activate their tier set bonuses. For easier raids or ones on farm, you may consider swapping around to a less than ideal comp to pick up certain tokens. Oh, and Druid Mage Rogue tokens? Yep, you're the ones who get DKs added to the list. Also, I'll be covering comps with one main tank here. Of course, this is very much gear, difficulty and fight dependent. Ideally though, you do just want to be one tanking as much as you possibly can because, well, one less tank means one more DPS and that means faster clears. Some fights absolutely do need more than one though, in which case assume one of the capable DPS has an off spec for it. That's the benefit of dual spec right there, and we're going to plan ahead with that in mind. So then, raid comps. It's actually a subject you could ask 10 different people, get 10 different answers, and as long as you're bringing a rainbow of all the different classes, it's probably a fine answer. Suffice to say there is a huge amount of flexibility in what you can bring, so it's mainly an exercise in building out a comp that synergizes well together and has as many buffs as it possibly can. So first we're going to look at two different 10-man raid comps, one focused around casters, a second around physical damage, and then one 25-man comp after. The first thing you want in a caster-based group is a good prop pally tank. In fact, you could say that for every single raid comp ever, but especially casters. The group is going to be stacking stuff that affects spells, and prop pally threat will be affected by this, so it sounds like a good match. Next up, a Demonology Warlock. They bring a spell power buff that scales with their gear called Demonic Pact, and they have the standard Warlock utility in your Healthstone and Soulstone, which makes them a staple for 10-man caster comps. Boomkin also fits well. We always want to have a Druid for Mark of the Wild, but for casters, Druids have Spell Crit, Haste, Innovate, and loads more on top of that. Unholy Death Knight is another auto-include for casters, which may be a bit of a surprise, but one of their talents in particular is just such a huge quality of life increase, it's kind of hard to ignore. It's called Ebon Plaguebringer. This essentially lets them cast Curse of Elements as an AoE with Pestilence. If you don't have this, either Locks or Boomkins have to do this single target through tabbing on each mob. Unholy DKs just doing this by default is a great benefit to have, and they scale with some spell damage through talents as well. We need some healers, of course. Disc Priests are just standalone good. They bring buffs that we're missing like Thought and Spirit, and of course Power Infusion for one of your casters. If we're talking casters, of course we've got to have a mage in the mix. They don't bring a huge amount utility-wide aside from intellect, but they're just good in general. I'll add fire here, but you could put arcane earlier in the expansion. At this point, we're only missing three things really: 5% spell haste, 3% crit, and of course a heroism. You could fill this gap with an elemental shaman, and frankly, the other three raid spots are flexible and you're more or less good to go. I know elemental gets a bad reputation in Wrath of the Lich King, and yes, the demonology spell buff is better, but your roster is going to have more than one shaman because 10-man raiding exists, and they cover the buffs very nicely. The other way to get the buffs, which you could do, is to add an enhancement shaman, but that means the enhance is dropping the spell haste totem, not wind fury for melee, which doesn't feel quite as good, though both these specs do a decent amount of spell damage for melees. In any case, we need two more DPS here and a healer. Holy Paladin is just always a good go-to for healers, so we're going to add one of them, and they synergize very well with Disc Priest. As for two more casters, why not get a Shadow Priest in there, and then throw in maybe an Affliction Lock as the final one. This comp only misses one buff, which is the flat 3% damage. The choice is to get that RBM Hunter, Rep Pala, or Arcane Mage. Your mage will be Arcane early on, so that won't be a problem, but I wouldn't really consider the other two choices for a caster comp just for the 3% damage. I'd put somebody else in who's going to make use of all these other buffs instead. Overall, you have a well-balanced comp, you're ticking nearly every box buff-wise, there's a strong amount of DPS and loads of utility. Let's take a look at melee then. Assuming the prop pala for the guild is saved and went with the casters, let's start with a Blood DK this time. They bring loads of the physical buffs themselves, spells such as strength and agility, 10% attack power, and they can also spec into 20% melee haste as well. And they also have Hysteria, the physical counterpart to power infusion for one of your DPSs. When you're doing melee, you've got to bring along a Ret. They're the class that covers the most buffs in the game by a long way. 3% haste, damage, crit on top of everything else they bring. And as you can see here, with only 2 classes in the raid, we're already a pretty good way to having every buff we need. I rate Resto Druids for melee comps. Your raiding team is probably going to have one. They have a talent called Revitalize, which is similar to the tier 3 2-set proc, if you can remember that, except it's even more powerful. Your raid's probably going to have a Feral Cat. They really start to blast DPS in Wrath of the Lich King. Also, they bring the 5% physical crit buff on top of the standard Druid utility. Finally, a Combat Rogue rounds out the buffs that were missing, like physical damage taken and armor reduction. You could take an Arms Warrior to get the same effect though, and this may even be better earlier into the expansion. At this point, the only class missing is a Shaman. Pretty much every buff is good to go, so really just take the remaining physical damage dealers from your raid and add them in. You're probably going to have an Enhancement Shaman, some form of Warrior DPS spec, some kind of Hunter DPS spec, and then finally one more spot and a healer. Again, a Holy Paladin is ideal. It doesn't really synergize too well with a Druid, but they're kind of OP. Last spot, Shadow Priest, I suppose, for the stamina buff, but you could just use scrolls if you really wanted them. You're probably going to have another Hunter or your raid's Frost DK, or just generally whatever you can get your hands on here. These are some ideas, at least, with actually keeping in mind you're trying to make 2 10-man rosters out of a 25-man group. Even then, there's going to be a few people missing. Generally speaking though, both of these comps would be absolutely fine. Speaking of 25-man then, what about that? Well, after having looked at the 10-man, it's going to be pretty straightforward. We take the strongest class that provides all the buffs we need, then we fill the gaps with high DPS. Let's start with the raid's main tank off tank combo. The go-to, generally speaking, is a Prot Pally main tank and a Blood DK off tank. Prot Pallas, as I'm sure I'll talk about at length in a run up to the expansion, are just kind of really overtuned on the final patch balance. They can do everything. They have a raid-wide cooldown in Divine Guardian. They can survive a fatal hit once every 2 minutes. They're very tanky. They do decent damage. Your guild is almost certainly going to have a Prot Paladin main tank. Blood DKs as an off tank offer the best single target threat through Icy Touch spam, which is ranged and are great for picking up adds. They also have Death Grip to quickly stack adds or remove them from a fight. Also, as mentioned earlier, they have loads of utility. Yes, people will absolutely clear raids without this tank lineup, but they'll have a bit of a harder time doing so, I'd say. Next, our healer lineup. Again, it's pretty set in stone as for what's accepted as the go-to. Expect people to opt for 2 Holy Paladins, 1 Disc Priest, 1 Resto Druid, 1 Resto Shaman. All healers are represented, but only one is stacked, which is the Holy Paladin. Much like Protection Paladin, again, they're just a bit too good this expansion. They pretty much don't know what the word is, they have more AoE capabilities, and they just do a lot of healing. Expect to see our Holy Paladins constantly doing the most healing throughout the expansion. Holy Priests are fine, by the way. They're a bit of a jack of all trades, but not really a master of any of them. You would either look to replace one Holy Paladin or the Resto Shaman most likely. You can't really remove the disc from a raid comp. Their ability to block damage before it happens is way too good, and Druids have good utility and Revitalize. Then again, you will see raids that only have 1 Shaman, which is the Resto in Wrath of the Lich King. Times do change from TBC now that Hero is raid wide. So DPS, let's get some mandatory casters in first with Demonology, Balance, and Shadow. The first 2 are just buff machines that do good damage. Shadow is not so much there for the damage, more utility. Also, they have the capability to soak damage on certain fights thanks to Dispersion. After that, we want at least 1 mage for the intellect buff and table, of course. Melee wise, it's pretty much just pick one of each spec. So I'm going to add in a Ret Pally, a Combat Rogue, an Enhancement Shaman, and a Fury Warrior. Of course, on top of that, we want an Unholy DK for the Ebon Plaguebringer debuff. You're probably going to have somebody in your raid that wants to play a Frost DK and at least 1 Hunter in there. Hunters are an absolute no-brainer to include. Misdirect is so useful, and now it only has a 30-second cooldown. So these remaining spots is where min-max guilds would put 5 Affliction locks. In fact, you could even remove a bunch of other classes and healers to add more Affliction locks if you really wanted to. Being more realistic though, I think you're going to have more than 1 mage player. They do scale very well, and a Wrath of the Lich King raid wouldn't be a raid without at least a few Affliction locks. Say 2 or 3 of them. The last 2 raid spots, again, you're probably going to have more than 1 Hunter player, and I bet you have another Rogue or a Warrior in there as well. This covers all the buffs. It's a good mix between melee and ranged DPS. You've got a good healing lineup and a very strong tank lineup as well. I'd be interested to see what the mega min-max guilds end up bringing when people are racing for the Yogg-Saron 0 lights encounter encounter in Ulduar, the raid's probably gonna look a bit more like this. Then again, there is the chance that people are overhyping affliction locks because so many private servers purposefully overbuff content so the execution phase of the fight gets way longer than it should be. Nevertheless, people do rate them and they're expected to be very good. Overall though, for 25-man, much like 10-man, it's pretty flexible and depends on what kind of classes you have access to. One final thing to mention is that whilst raids won't be hard at the start of the game in tier 7, in Ulduar, some of the hard modes, particularly Firefighter and Yogg Zero Lights, are going to be quite difficult compared to what we've seen so far. And as you get better at fights and gradually begin to find them easier, the first thing that happens is that you reduce the number of healers you bring so you can add more DPS so you can just get through the fights faster. I've healed in later expansions than Wrath, and this does happen on fights where even if you know them inside out, it's easy to wipe if somebody messes up. Simply put, if you don't need the extra healers, there is every chance you are asked to flex to a DPS for some fights, and dual spec allows this as well, so it's just something to think about. If you are maining a healer and you're not a Holy Paladin or the Disc Priest, you may be asked to flex during this expansion. In fact, I think a bunch of raids will get to a point where their healer comp is 2 Holy Paladins and a Disc Priest, but we'll see what people are able to pull off. Overall though, I hope that gives you a decent impression of what raid comps look like in Wrath and exactly why. Let me know your thoughts on everything and what you bring, whether you change anything too significantly. As always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in. I shall see you all in the next one very soon.